We're ready to go.
Okay, it's May 7th. Time for the 161st edition of Hitting Left with the Klonsky brothers. I'm Mike Klonsky here with my brother Fred, coming at you on Lumpen Radio, WLPN 105.5 FM in Chicago. And we are distancing physically, but socially and politically, we're connecting via Zoom again today with an old friend of ours, activist, writer, and historian, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Good morning to you, Roxanne, and Fred. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Mike and Fred.
Where are you at, Roxanne?
I'm in
California?
San Francisco. Mm-hmm.
San Francisco. But you are are you still teaching at Hayward, at UC Hayward?
I am retired, and ever since I retired in 2012, I've been writing books. So it's been a wonderful retirement, not having to grade papers and do administrative stuff, but still get to talk with a lot of students because I've been also traveling almost nonstop since 2014, when my Indigenous Peoples History of the United States came out. It really took off in ways that no other book of mine has, and no one expected, including the publisher. It's become the best-selling book of Beacon Press in hardback, first of all, and in paperback. So I get invited all the time. So I get to speak with thousands of students, in the last 6 years. So it's been wonderful to be free of the responsibilities, but still be able to teach. I love that.
And lately, during the this quarantine period, have you been working on another book or hunkering down or what?
Yes, I have a book contract with Beacon I've had for 3 years, and with all the travel, just never was getting to it. So the isolation is probably less onerous for me than almost anyone I know, because in lockdown, although, it's so weird that I easily get distracted. So I haven't got as much done as I wanted, thought I could, but it's, I work on it every day and do a lot of Zoom talks.
You find that that these last couple of months have kind of forced you into a regular schedule? I know that's kind of happened to me. I was probably as more undisciplined as a retired teacher than you are, but I find that even though it seems like nothing's really changed for me, I find myself getting into doing certain things at certain times during the day, planning dinners. Like we would go out. Now we don't go out for dinner anymore, so we plan. What about you? Do you have a schedule now?
Well, I'm alone in my place, and I have because I was traveling so much. I always had a pretty chaotic schedule. When I was home, catching up on things, just paying bills and seeing a few friends and all.
Speak up, Roxanne.
In between trips, just not really having a set schedule. It's been really interesting, because I think partly to keep one's sanity in these situations, it's important to really build a schedule and follow it, and not sleep all day or watch TV all day or watch movies all day. So I've done that, and of course I've planned elaborate meals like I never have before.
Well, Roxanne, we've known each other, I guess, for about 50 years. But for our audience, I'd like you to say something about your background. I know you were born and grew up in Oklahoma. You wrote a book called Red Dirt. And I just looked at it again with the intro by Mike Davis. Really good stuff. And I think the subtitle was "Growing Up Okie."
Right.
Tell us about your background, your family. I know you were named after the founders of the IWW, the Wobblies.
Well, my father was named by his father. My father's name is Moyer Haywood
Oh,
Scarberry
your father, that's right.
Dunbar. Yeah. And so he told me stories my entire childhood of, I was a good listener. I was a sickly child and asthmatic. So he had a captive audience and he was a great storyteller. But I would ask him over and over, tell me what the names are. So he'd tell me the biographies of each of these heroes. And because he knew, because his father was a very active Socialist Party, but also the IWW in Oklahoma. And I think it's pretty well known that Oklahoma per capita had the most socialists of any state, and it they won. They controlled almost all the local offices in Oklahoma, a few statewide, and obviously voted for Debs in every election and campaign, and so many women involved, and also Muskogee Indian families from the Red Sticks, the very, very radical. So it was and also African Americans, tenant farmers. It was a very interesting place. So I told that story in the, to some extent, in that memoir, Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie.
And then you, well, your family was maybe before you were born. They were run out of town by the Klan. You don't usually think of these poor white folks being run out of town or attacked by the Klan. Is that, growing up like that, how's that influenced your thinking about white working class and poor folks in regards to movement organizing?
Well, yeah, when the Palmer raids took place and the repression of the socialists, when World War I started, it became almost a crime practically not to support the war, and they were against the war. Debs went to prison, and my grandfather locally, they controlled the school board. He was a county commissioner. They ran for local offices. He was a veterinarian. He was a professional man. He had 7 children when he became a socialist in Missouri and then moved to Oklahoma. But he lost everything. The Klan drove them out. They moved to San Antonio, where he got work as a veterinarian, but he was blacklisted after the repression. So my dad refused to go. He was only 15 when they moved, 16 or so, and he didn't finish high school. He just started working for other farmers. So he was a tenant farmer. When I grew up, we moved from place to place in the county and different farms, tenant farming and sharecropping. So we were very poor, but he actually had a pretty kind of middle-class upbringing, small town middle-class upbringing, not rich, but his dad was a large animal veterinarian and the only one in the county. So he had a lot of business, and he also had a farm. He had land, but he lost it. So at that point, the people who had land, settlers who had land and doing well, if they did get involved in these things, they lost it. But then during the Depression, they lost, practically all of them lost land and became fruit pickers in California. So it was, I really, really am so grateful that I had that knowledge when I was young. I never saw it in any history books. There was no way anyone could have learned about the Socialist Party in Oklahoma at that time when I was growing up without that personal oral history, which most people didn't tell. And when the second Red Scare happened in the 50s, and especially when the Rosenbergs were executed, I remember my father was very upset And he told me, don't talk about your grandfather, to anyone. It's just between us. Because he was really scared because he knew what a Red Scare was.
And you
And
knew our dad,
when
who was
did
a
you,
victim of the
when did
50s, of the
you,
McCarthy period.
sorry, what, Mike?
I said, Roxanne, you also knew our dad, our family,
Yes, yes,
who were victims of the McCarthy period and the Red
yes.
Scare. Yeah, went to prison during that time.
Yeah, that's when I could really, when I went to UCLA to do my doctorate in 64 to 68, I was there. And it was just at the end of your dad's bookstore, I think, during that time. But we radicals would drift down there. We could sit for hours, and between his selling books and talking to other people, he would just kind of tolerate us and tell us things and ask us about ourselves. And
Yeah.
we really loved him. There were a few people like that around. That it was of course, Dorothy Healy was very prominent at the time and was kind of a mentor of all of us. So the radical politics, I'd been in San Francisco State. I moved out and came to San Francisco State, but it wasn't yet that active, in 1960 to 63. When I was there, it was still mostly all white, and it was working class, but really got active later, a couple of years later.
And then did you join SDS?
I actually joined the Du Bois Club when I was at, I just said that they weren't very radical, but the Du Bois Club had just started at San Francisco State, and I got recruited to it.
And that was the Communist Party's youth organization.
Yes, yeah. And they brought, Malcolm X came and spoke in a little classroom, just about 20 of us. He wasn't well known yet,
What were when you were up in San Francisco, was when you came into your own on political matters, became active, and around what issues at that time?
Well, what was going on campus that was really big was recruiting. When I first started there, recruiting for the Freedom Rides. And the thing is, I was married. I got married at 18 and then sent my husband to school to do engineering. And so I was married, and he was not very political. He wasn't right wing or anything. He was just an engineer, not very political. And I hadn't been either that much, but I was getting politicized. So there wasn't that much I could do. And I've written about it some. I felt very alienated, that there was a kind of special language and a special kind of way of behaving and dressing that I dressed like Jackie Kennedy in those little linen shifts and little heels and a bouffant hairdo. And so, they wouldn't talk to me. And it was actually one of the few African-American students, Art Sheridan, who was in the Du Bois Club. They came up to me in the cafeteria and sat down. I was sitting alone, and he sat down. He showed me this flyer about the Malcolm X. I'd never heard of Malcolm X. I'd never heard of W.B. Du Bois. And he started educating me and recruited me. And so I was very alienated, though, from the white activists. The Hallinan were there. A couple of the Hallinan guys were there, big shots on campus. And they just seemed really arrogant. And I also was alienated because they started singing. When I said I was from Oklahoma, they said, "Oh, well, you must know all about Woody Guthrie." That's the first time I ever heard the word Woody Guthrie. I didn't know he existed, even. He was banned in Oklahoma. The only song of his we knew and we didn't know, we thought it was a traditional song, was the Hills of Oklahoma, which actually his brother wrote, it turns out. But so I said, "No, who's that?" So I seemed really stupid, I'm sure, because I was, I came from a rural background with not very much education.
And then what turned that around?
Well, at San Francisco State, I remained a bit alienated. I had to work really hard, for my classes to do well. I majored in history. And then one of my professors had great confidence in me for some reason or other I never figured out. But he wanted me to go to graduate school. It had never been a horizon I even considered. And he, because it used to work this way, he was, had gotten his PhD at UC Berkeley. And he was in with these scholars who in his time, in the 40s and 50s, were doing this hemispheric work and US imperialism in Latin America. So I gotten very interested in imperialism because of his classes and his viewpoint. He was a radical German immigrant. And I said, okay. And I went to UC Berkeley. I was way, it was way above my head. I wanted to do European history because I wanted to understand imperialism. So I went into my first seminar on German history, the German Landesherren. It was very specific, and I wanted to learn about the land situation in what led up to imperialism. And the professor, who was German, started speaking in German, and I said, oh boy. I mean, I was able to read and write it. I had to take a test, but I
talk about German imperialism.
No, but then he laughed and he said, no, the seminar will be in English. And I said, oh God. So I learned a lot there, but I then went to Mexico after the first year, and I decided this is where I'm going to really learn about imperialism, is doing Latin American history. So I called up from Mexico to UC Berkeley, and I said, I want to change my emphasis, from Europe to Latin America. And they said, well, we don't do Latin America here. You have to go to UCLA for that. So they transferred.
They don't do Latin America at Berkeley. Huh?
Well, it was the old, it was the whole UC system of the different campuses doing different things. They did Europe and Asia at Berkeley. They did Latin America and area studies, Africa and, Latin America. And, and then at UC Santa Cruz, they did the Oxford College style. So they had a different purpose at that time in the grand plan that Reagan kind of destroyed, when he went after the whole UC system.
So when you kind of shifted to Latin America, is that what connected you to the whole indigenous issue, the issue of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere? Is that what did it?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about nothing but imperialism, and even people who weren't, very radical. It was just obvious, and it was soon after the Cuban Revolution. So everything that they were doing, I could see later at UCLA, was trying to figure out imperialism, how to defeat it, how to defeat resistance against it. Not really, we weren't supposed to be using it in other ways as scholars, but I didn't know that at the time. And several people in the seminar, that first seminar in Latin American history, were Marxists. One was even a Maoist already. This was 1964, pretty early for Maoism. He was in, I guess, progressive labor. So it really did. And then too, because the war, that was exactly when the Gulf of Tonkin took place, and then the invasion of Dominican Republic, and of course, the assassination of Malcolm X. And so definitely UCLA, you probably remember, was not a very activist campus in the beginning when I was there. It was very
Right.
white.
They had no SES chapter all the way up through
No.
the late 60s.
In fact, Mike Davis, in his recent book on the radical movement in Los Angeles in the 60s, points out that the two main campuses, USC and UCLA, were not the centers of radical student activity, but it was the junior colleges at Valley State in Northridge and at LA City College downtown, which was a two-year junior college, where actually that's where all the radical student activity in the 60s in LA was taking place.
And it was really true, but I think he didn't understand a lot of things that were going on there, you know, if you were there, that were significant, even though they were small. Like, for instance, Ron Takaki, there was big pressure to have, they had African studies. We had a lot of African students. That's how I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, was ANC people, but no African American studies. They had Latin American literature that was really quite developed, but no Mexicans. You know, Latin America was South America, not Mexico or Central America. So there were a couple of Chicanos who were very active that they do deal with in the book, with Juan Gomez Quinones and the Chicano movement later in the 60s. But they were there. They were, Juan and I were in that first seminar together. So there was a lot of activity going on there, and especially the first anti-apartheid student movement in the world was founded there by a South African, and I joined it right away. So they kind of left it out because it was not that active, but there were seeds there that made it very volatile later. It makes it a little hard to understand when they do get into the Black Panthers and the U.S. Shootout. How did it become so radical, in 1969, when nothing had happened before? So obviously some things were going on. And one was they hired Ron Takaki in 1966 to teach the first African American history course. And Ron had just gotten his doctorate at UCLA. He's the sort of father of ethnic studies. He invented ethnic studies and started the one at Berkeley. But he had come down, this was his first teaching position. And I was a teaching assistant. I was by then a senior teaching assistant because I passed my pre-doctoral exams. So I had first choice of who to TA for, and I wanted to learn, what he was teaching. So I volunteered. And the first day of class, about 400 people in the class, the whole front row, they were mostly white students because it was mostly white campus. The whole front row were very militant looking African Americans who come up from South Central. And they kind of sat there with their arms crossed, and Ron didn't, he didn't say anything, but he was very democratic teacher. Most lecturers just in those big classes just gave their lecture and then handed students over to the teaching assistants for smaller groups later. But not Ron, he opened up for class discussion. So they had a plan. They raised their hand. They were checking him out. And he was so good. He was so radical. He's Japanese Hawaiian, very working class guy. He really knew his stuff, and it was he was very militant in his history work. but very, very good scholar. And so they asked him a few questions and, engaged, and it really made an interesting class. And afterwards they asked if they could audit, and he said, sure. So in, faculty freedom, you're supposed to really do anything you want in your classroom as long as you don't hurt someone or, hit them or something. It's supposed to be at the university level, completely unmonitored. But
that was back in the day, not like today.
Yeah, but he got fired. He got fired. They fired him.
I remember. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
And then you also had Angela Davis was out there.
Yeah, well, she came up after the Panthers were really active on campus, became very active on campus.
And then you went on to found the ethnic studies program up at Hayward.
I didn't. Yes, I definitely was one of the co-founders. I was hired there to teach Native American studies, which had already been set up by a graduate student from Stanford. He set it up very well, and then he recruited me to teach it. I just got my doctorate, and so I said I would. He kind of convinced me, and it was. So I was. We had these little bitty programs. We had Chicano studies and Native American studies, and African American studies was a little bit more developed and was on its way to becoming a department. But what we decided to do collectively was to create ethnic studies with these autonomous programs within it.
Okay, Roxanne,
how are we doing on time?
Yeah, we're going to take a couple minutes break here, and then we'll get back to this story in a minute. So we'll take a break now and come back.
Thank you.
Okay, this is WLPN LP, Lumpen Radio, coming out of Bridgeport in Chicago. It's Hitting Left with the Klonsky brothers, and we're here every Friday at 11 a.m. live. And then, of course, you can catch us on podcasts that are archived, and just Google Hitting Left with the Klonsky brothers.
We just heard Paula Nelson's band, which I was listening to because of the whole Corona thing. Just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in. For those of you who might remember.
So we're here with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and we're talking about her own story and her connection with the struggles of Indigenous people, which we really haven't gotten into yet, but gotten her own life story, which inevitably.
Well, let's get into that. Let's get into that, Fred.
Again?
I say let's get into that.
Yeah.
After a wound.
Can I say? So you wrote a book about the history of Indigenous people in the Americas. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about the book.
Well, an Indigenous people's history of the United States is really a history of the United States, and from the perspective of how Indigenous peoples experienced it. So it's not really a history of the Native nations, in the United States in any kind of detail. It's really a history of the United States. I think it could be titled The Military History of the United States, because that's what I really discovered. I knew this, but it became very clear in trying to do a coherent narrative of this sort and really reinterpret U.S. history, that it was 300 years of war. All out war against 300 Native nations in North America. And that's how long it took to take the continent. So the kind of colonialism it was, and why warfare was the main instrument of it, is it was eliminationist, it was settler colonialism, to replace the existing people, take the very rich and developed land that they confiscated. It was not a wilderness. at all. It was had been developed over a period of 50,000 years by native farmers, agriculturalists, fishing peoples. It was a continent of villages and city-states and civilizations, and a lot of it fed from central Mexico. The cultures, the corn is the central sacred food item and symbol of life. So this attempt at total destruction is really what made the United States what it is, a fiscal military state. And it's really baked into the Constitution itself. The book I'm writing on right now is about the idea of the United States being a nation of immigrants. So the first thing I'm taking on is the fallacy of the Alexander Hamilton and the Broadway musical, that he was an immigrant, which he wasn't. That he was he's really the architect of the fiscal military state, and this means a state that is created for war. So we always seem very confused about why the United States is always at war. But once you ground yourself in this history, you have to say, well, of course the U.S. is always involved in war, because that is what it was created for. It created a state for war. So that's the essence of that book. And
not only created for war, but also created for a class war, and for a war to keep down the oppressed people right within our borders, being a country of immigrants and also of indigenous people. Now, you got involved with the American Indian movement after Wounded Knee, right? After 73. And so aside from writing books, you've been an activist as part of the American Indian movement for all these years.
Yes, everything I learned about Native peoples, and frankly, learned in depth about the United States, is I learned from the activism, from the people themselves and being involved. I was my first intense involvement was a year after Wounded Knee, when more than 300 Native people, most of them Lakota from South Dakota, and many other Native nations, and also allies, white and Black Chicano allies, had crimes and misdemeanors against them. So there was the American Indian movement decided to have the lawyers put all those cases together and bring a motion to dismiss all of them based upon the Sioux Treaty of 1868. So I got recruited. This is how I got involved in AIM. I got recruited by Vine Deloria. I was actually in law school at the University of Santa Clara. I left UCLA and became a revolutionary and didn't want to even turn back. So I did go back and do my dissertation finally, but I had decided to go to law school. So one of the lawyers involved in the Wounded Knee defendants was based in San Jose, and I was at Santa Clara University. So they came, recruiting at the law school, him, Vine Deloria, and found me. I held up my hand. Okay, I'll work on this. And I was working at the Legal Aid Society too, part-time, and there was a lawyer there that was very involved in the cases. So I thought it would just be a kind of legal thing. I didn't really intend to do this the rest of my life and be, um, be devoted to or to teach Native American studies at the time. So that was a very in-depth experience, 2 weeks, very intensive, to see how the Lakota people organized themselves. They had mass meetings. For one thing, about 5,000 people came down to Lincoln, Nebraska, December, in the middle of winter, deadly cold, put up tents down by the river, the Missouri River, and created a whole community. So every evening after a day of testimony, they would meet with the lawyers in these huge meetings. They would have a feast, cook for us all, and then tell the lawyers what they wanted to do the next day.
Sounds like a precursor to Standing Rock.
It was incredible. Yeah, it's exactly if that experience made me understand, what was going on easily at Standing Rock, was that same process of that collectivity. It's just something we rarely get to experience in the United States, and even in the left, with all the attempts to do that, it's just very, very hard to do without understanding that they don't debate. They basically, everyone speaks. These meetings would go on for hours, 5 and 6 hours. But I've read historically where some meetings where they're trying to deal with the United States, they gather together sometimes for 30, 40 days of almost nonstop discussion. And what they do is each person speaks and no one speaks back to that. They don't argue with each other. They all speak, and somehow out of that, comes a decision, a conclusion. It's really an incredible process, very hard to. But I learned that process, and then these lawyers, of course, already had been schooled in this, and Vine Deloria, of course, was raised this way. So it was a beautiful experience for them. And that it was really wonderful to see at Standing Rock all the old Amesters who had been at Wounded Knee.
Right, that was fun.
Cooking, organizing,
right,
bossing people around. It was beautiful. You took some students over there, didn't you?
I did. We took some neighborhood students over there, and it was a life-changing experience for them.
They put you in the diplomatic corps, I think, didn't they?
Oh my goodness!
I'm the last person. I'm the last person you'd want in the diplomatic corps.
That's a frightening thought.
But I think they placed you though where you all stayed near the diplomatic sector.
It was a life-changing experience for me too, Roxanne. Roxanne, we don't have that much time. I want to kind of bring us up to date. Right now, the pandemic has really struck hard at Native American communities around the country, and I even read today that the data that they're collecting everywhere on the coronavirus has left out Native Americans. They're not even being counted as even though they've been tested as much as anybody. Anyway, tell us something. What do you know about the impact of coronavirus on the indigenous peoples here?
Well, just like we're all experiencing or observing, and some of us already knew, but not to the extent that it exists, at least I didn't, the hollowing out of public services in general, federal agencies, the CDC, they're useless. They're not doing anything, because they were hollowed out. And, it's not just Trump, it's back to Clinton, back to Reagan, mainly back to Reagan, the beginning, but they all have participated in it. The Clinton administration, the Obama administration, they just keep taking out, squeezing out, just like they do Social Security, and any kind of public goods, being privatized. And that's the whole neoliberal fascist, I call it, process. So for Native people, that is, a doubly onerous, because they already, had a sketchy Indian health service, which was a part of all the treaties signed as restitution in exchange for land, and it was to be in perpetuity. So they can't really do away with the Indian health service, under their own laws, but they've hollowed it out so that it's, they do the best they can. Some wonderful volunteers go and volunteer and work in the Indian Health Service and under really bad, poor conditions. But they're just not equipped to deal with this, at all. And the Navajo Nation, which is the largest land base and the largest population, is the hardest hit. And of course, the Hopi Nation is inside the Navajo Nation. So it's hard hit.
Well, this week, the Health Authority of the Navajo Nation, which includes areas of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico, reported 1,197 positive corona cases and 44 deaths. And if it were, I just read, if it were a state, it would rank third in the country for confirmed cases per 100,000 population, behind only New York and New Jersey.
That's right. It's very intense. And the other, there are so many people with preconditions, diabetes, because of the poor food. A lot of people have to live on government commodities, and this is white flour, white rice, lard, processed cheese, very few fresh vegetables, and so these are the poorest people. Are something like 60% of the Lakotas at Pine Ridge have diabetes, and I'm sure it's about, I think that's the most extreme, but it's very high in general in the U.S. population. And obesity that does not come from overeating, it comes from the malnutrition.
It's a function of poverty, isn't it? It's a
function of poverty.
Yes.
And so these pre-existing conditions make the Native people much more vulnerable, those on reservations, and many in the cities too, more vulnerable. The other thing is the social distancing is really difficult when 8 people live in a hogan, which is one room. It's not as bad now as when it started, when it was very cold, to be able to even go outside that much. But clearly the conditions of people crowded together is a it also just the communal style of life, of cooking together, of doing everything together, makes it very difficult culturally to do the things to prevent contact.
As a historian, I mean, it seems to me anyway, I want to get your take on this, the onset of the coronavirus and its transmission to indigenous populations and reservations kind of brings us full circle from the days of settler colonialism and smallpox and all that, when the settlers actually brought, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not, these European diseases to indigenous people here.
Yeah, and it really does show, how how it works here, that the pre-existing conditions are what allows a pandemic or a disease to spread, because Native people before invasion were really practiced very strict hygiene. They bathed all the time, bathed and did sweat baths, and ate very, very healthy food and raised their own food. They lived long lives. They were living 20 years longer on the average than Europeans at the same time, and before 1492. So these wars that started immediately from 1607 on, then create refugee situations. Their crops are burned. Their storehouses of food are burned. They're left without food or means. Their exposure. They're outside in lean-tos and all instead of their nice little houses, in villages. So they're susceptible. So it's not lack of immunity. I think they had a lot of immunity, or there would not be a single Native person left right now. But under those conditions, that's when the pandemics would take off, and it wasn't just smallpox, it was malaria that was brought, it was cholera, it was
Bubonic plague even.
Measles and bubonic plague. So these were, I don't think, I don't really buy the idea that they ever actually did germ warfare. They did warfare, and then that allowed the germs to spread. So I think that germ theory of U.S. colonialism is a way of getting around the fact that it was violence, violence that caused the situations where pandemics could form.
But the thing that strikes me, Roxanne, is when you describe these the problem of the pre-existing conditions, for example, that we're learning here. And I think, in fact, Chicago was one of the first places where the data began to show that it was in the African American community
Right.
that the virus was killing and affecting the most people. And now we're learning in this last week that the Latino communities are now the hotspot for, and all of these, really wherever people of color and people who are living in poverty, they become the victims of this pandemic. And it seems like that's what ties all of this together with the history of Native people in this country, is that these are the targets and these are the victims of these kind of pandemics.
Yeah, it's also true here in the Bay Area that African Americans, twice as much percentage of their population, are the victims of some of the worst cases, and the deaths, the actual death count. African Americans, Mexican, and who knows, with the agricultural workers out there without any kind of protection or any kind of
That's right. Yeah.
provision, providing our food for us. It's just, it's just criminal that they're not being tested, they're not being monitored. When they're doing this essential work, they're doing that with, our workers in the cities, but it's just like, well, they're just, dispensable. There are more of them where they came from,
How are we doing on time, my brother?
Well, we have about 5 more minutes.
Roxanne, since looking back on Standing Rock, which kind of ended abruptly, and it was a bit, it was a great thing. Being part of that community was, like I said, it was a life-changing experience for a lot of us. But then it ended. The pipeline went ahead with support from Trump and the Republicans and Democrats too, who were who gave in on a lot of that, including the Obama administration. What's happened to the movement post Standing Rock? Where is it right now? Where's the resistance taking place?
Well, it's really interesting because so many people did experience, like you did, a day to 2 days. Some people stayed for 2 months or so. And I think every single one of them had a profound experience in that situation. So, what was already developing out of New Mexico and Arizona was what came to be called the Red Nation. And the Red Nation people were in the leadership because of Nick Estes, who is Lakota and from an AIM family.
Nick was the one who helped me get up there.
Right, yeah.
And I think you turned me on to Nick, if I remember correctly.
I did. And I said, take care of Tony and his, or Mike and his students. And he put you in, he says, I put him in the diplomatic section. So Nick was, really an important leader at Standing Rock, and others from the Red Nation, his partner, Melanie Yassi, who's Dene. But Red Nation really started around doing patrols. It reminded me, and of course, is probably they were somewhat emulating the Black Panthers and their patrols of the streets, and then the American Indian movement started doing that in Minneapolis, and then the La Raza, and these kind of patrols. So what they in Phoenix and in Albuquerque, the majority of the homeless people and are Native people, Navajos, and young white guys just love to go out, mostly middle-class kids, and burn up their camps, or even torture them, try to put them on fire. And there've been lots of deaths, lots of beatings. And so they just, it was actually, at that time, Nick was a doctoral student. He and his partner, Melanie, are both doctoral students in American Studies at University of New Mexico, and their mentor and professor was Jennifer DeTatali, who's a Navajo historian and an activist. And she said, you know what? This has got to stop. We've got to do something. So they started doing patrols, taking, every night, take each group of people taking a couple of hours each to drive around to the camps, to have someone in each homeless camp. And they really did put a stop to it. They did the same thing in Gallup and in Phoenix, and they're still continuing that. But then they began developing, of course, Standing Rock, they got a lot of practice of organizing and learning from others, and also all those old Inksters there, kind of a lot of mentorship going on, and exchanges. It's just an incredible process. So Red Nation has become a very preeminent organization. I think it is the most, honestly, the most perfect social movement organization that's ever come out of the United States. It's phenomenal. And I was down there February 19th and 20th. I was asked to do a keynote speech at the 50th anniversary of Native American Studies there at University of New Mexico. So I had the chance to go. I've visited before, but not since they've had their own building. And to go there and hear about the work they've been doing and just be in this space, kind of a warehouse that they work out of. So I really recommend to your listeners that they go to the Red Nation, TRN.org, I think, and read their manifesto. Read about they're doing Friday night web airs. Is that what they're called?
Webinars, yeah.
And they're doing podcasts. It seemed like almost every day, interviewing people, and there's so much material there. But it's amazing, the women's leadership. And the other thing amazing is, for the first time, young Pueblo Indians who are reticent to get involved in movements because they're very well organized, and they've survived Spanish colonialism. a period of Mexican colonialism and U.S. colonialism, pretty much with their social orders intact, and not without a lot of resistance, including a revolution in 1680, and where they kicked the Spanish out for 12 years. The Spanish came back. So they
Sounds like they have a sense of their own history.
they do, and they turn inwards. So they discourage young Pueblos. I was married to one, Simon Ortiz, and I knew they really have to leave. They're fine if they leave and go somewhere else and do something, but not in the name of the Pueblo. And that's really changed. It changed in 2016 when young Pueblo women went and joined a march in Santa Fe against the Hispano celebration.
I remember that.
Roxanne, I hate to interrupt. We could go on another hour, but I'm afraid that we're out of time. But want to thank you so much. I've learned so much this past hour.
Thank you, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. We love you, and hope to have you back again. And you're going to like this, Roxanne. We're going to be taken out with the Buena Vista Social Club from Havana, singing Chan Chan. So tune in next week, everybody. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.